Well, we're back with Lab Talks, and it's Scott and I, and we are sitting in the beautiful office of Myron Steeves, a Newport Beach attorney, Dean of Trinity Law School. I think he was a little surprised seeing us walk in this place in jeans, but we snuck in, and he let us. We're used to getting kicked out, not coming in. So thank you so much for having us today. What an honor! And there's kind of a dual purpose here. Like, we kill two birds with one stone. We have all the startup founders and small business CEOs that get to talk to somebody who's an entrepreneur, had to start something. And then to get into kind of the church plant innovators and to get into that side of our conversation today. So tell us about you. Are you a California guy? Did you start out out here?
I'm from Canada originally.
You are?
Yeah, Canadian, but immigrated at a very young age.
Okay.
So all of my education was in the United States. I grew up in Seattle.
Okay.
My parents were missionaries in Ethiopia.
Wow.
Out of Canada, and came back. And we immigrated after their missionary career ended. I was born after that.
Which city were you here around that? When you came to California, what city did you get?
Came to LA County. I went to Biola College as an undergrad.
Okay.
So lived in La Mirada.
Okay.
And I've been in Southern California except for just a couple of brief excursions outside of California for 40 years now.
Now, were you in Ethiopia yourself?
No.
That was pre...
That was before I came along. I had two siblings that were born in Ethiopia, and I was born in Canada.
Okay. So how does that, if your parents have been in ministry in Ethiopia and you've seen all the poverty and you've seen, I don't know, I've never been there, but, I would imagine that's the case. How does that affect, like, being a kid, growing up in that family? Did they cut out the ice cream and no extras?
No, it was a pretty normal kind of life. But both my parents had large families, so a lot of siblings, and every one of them was a missionary or pastor.
Okay, wow.
So I think 9 siblings between the two families.
Wow.
And only one did not become a missionary. He became a pastor, and I think that was health issues. Okay. So these were families that were passionate about worldwide evangelism.
Okay.
And that was not unusual in the Canadian prairies. Churches raised up kids to take the gospel to the ends of the earth.
Wow.
And it hit everybody in the family.
Okay. So you were a Christian missionary in the Middle East. Is that correct?
Yeah, I was based in the U.S., but my travel was primarily focused on Asia.
Okay.
So I spent some time in Egypt, the United Arab Emirates.
Okay. What was the age range when you were doing that?
Early 20s.
Okay. And so how did this law thing, how do you go from being a missionary to a lawyer?
Well, I had a passion for ministry at a very young age. As a teenager, I decided I wanted to be in ministry. And then when the opportunity finally came, I found that I was channeled into management and administration early on in projects rather than direct ministry.
Okay.
I was terribly frustrated by that at first.
So describe that a little bit. So you're talking about, so you jump in, you think you're going to be a part of evangelism, and then they say you're going to go...
Yeah, they put me in charge of the training program for new missionaries rather than my being out there as an evangelist. And I did better in the administration side than I did in the direct ministry. But I was a little blind to that at the time.
So they recognized some skills that you
I think that was the case, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And in my hierarchy, the ministry was more important than the support side, so I resisted that, but still ended up being put in those positions where I would manage and organize things.
Okay.
So a point came when I decided I'm going to embrace this rather than fight it. So I wanted to develop some kind of managerial skill that would help. And it was a total whim that I decided maybe I should be a lawyer. It only took about 5 minutes from when I first had the thought to realizing there's actually nothing standing in the way of my going down that path. I was 26 at the time.
Wow.
I thought this is a little late in life to start a new career. In hindsight, that was kind of a naive thought.
Right.
But I found out that day what it would take to get into law school and pursued that path really starting that day.
Wow.
And my plan was that I wanted to become a lawyer, to provide legal services for Christian missions and churches. And I ended up doing that. It was a long route. It took about 18 years as a lawyer before my practice was completely focused on this kind of work. And it was a strange journey, but actually a good one. I spent 18 years as a business litigator, and that has served me very well in the work that I do now.
I bet.
There are a number of us that provide legal services for churches. It's rare in that crowd to have anybody who started as a litigator. So I'm happy for that experience, that I can navigate litigation well.
What was the hardest part about becoming a lawyer?
The cultural change. I was raised in a Christian home, went to Christian schools from preschool through college.
Okay.
And
That was
then,
Biola?
That was Biola.
Okay.
And then I worked in a Christian organization.
Okay.
And some things that we think of as a discipline of Christian living didn't really require much discipline on my part. Like corporate prayer
Yeah.
was a part of all of my schooling and all of my jobs. We had chapel services at the mission agency. And when I went to law school, it was really the first time that I'd cut those ties. And I found that I didn't really have much of a discipline at all. And while there was never a point where I rejected my Christian faith, I think you could say that I was maybe ideologically a Christian, but didn't invest any time or effort in it for about 8 years. That was the biggest challenge.
Okay.
And being exposed to a wider group of people than I'd encountered before, there's a sense in which in a Christian school, you meet people that have the same denominational background, kind of the same upbringing, socioeconomically or kind of the same.
Yeah, kind of in you're in your own little bubble.
And law school was just so diverse. And that was a real struggle for me.
Where did you go to law school?
Georgetown.
Okay. So you have to pass the bar.
Yeah.
Do we tell how many tries?
Oh, sure. We should have gone to that ahead of time, but I did pass on the first time.
Okay. I had a friend of mine, the mentor friend that I was talking about, and his dad had established this good size it was a good size practice, and my best friend, of course, his dad's involved. It took him, I think like 3 times, but it was so humiliating, because his dad every time. He was a smart guy, but he just wasn't good at taking a test.
Well, it's a very distinct skill, and I know many people that I consider to be much more brilliant than I could ever hope to be that didn't pass on the first time. And part of it is a time-tested test. And the person I was closest to, my study partner, was so much smarter than me. I was intimidated by him all the time. I thought he was going to pass and I wouldn't. And it was the reverse, and largely because he got so caught up in one essay question that he took more time than one should. I'm sure that question he answered brilliantly, but he didn't have enough time to answer the others. And so he did not pass and I did. And then next time around he passed. And so he's flourished since then.
So you pass the test, then you got to figure out, then you got to get a job.
Yeah.
What was getting a job like back? What year was this?
This was, I graduated in 1990.
90, okay. And so, were there any TV figures that were, lawyers that you look up to and you go, I want to be like that guy?
The big cultural impact on law school when I went in was the show LA Law.
Okay.
A lot of people.
Wow, yeah.
Because on that show you see lawyers make a lot of money, they don't seem to ever work, and they're never alone. But the reality is, being a lawyer is kind of a lonely job. You spend a lot of time in your office poring over notes, and that was not portrayed on LA Law very well.
So Porsche's, what was that?
Yeah.
What was the character, Bernstein, or the main character?
Corbin Bernstein.
Yeah.
Yeah, that show, you watched it, and everybody wanted to be a lawyer.
Yeah.
You were a jet setter.
Yeah, and legal education was growing at that time, and a lot went to law school because of the impact of that show, and a long run of very favorable portrayals of lawyers on TV. Right. And
so today would be what, Suits? Is that a pretty, or I don't, is that still around, Suits?
I think it ended, but that had quite a run.
Yeah.
So how did you decide getting your first job? What's that like coming out of law school?
Well, at that time, for big law, you get your job after your first year of law school. You line up that position during that first summer.
Okay.
And you do a clerkship.
Okay.
And interestingly, you don't do a lot of legal work. They're mostly sizing you up for whether you've socially got what it takes. Will you not be an embarrassment to the firm?
Itself is sizing you up. Okay.
Yeah, and that didn't work out for me the first year, but I lined up my employer during my second summer, and Georgetown is in D.C., and we wanted to come back to L.A., so I came out for the summer, stayed on campus at USC.
Wow.
And took the bus downtown for my clerkship, and that was the job that was lined up. And a big law firm has a lot going for it. The thing I miss the most about that era is having a virtually unlimited budget to research anything that impacted a client, because your clients have a lot of money, and they're there in a crisis, they'll spend a lot. But I was not suited for large firm life. I didn't like the big corporate structure. I liked the perks, but I really didn't like the atmosphere. I'm much more relational, and it's a fiercely competitive environment. So I went to smaller and smaller firms and got happier the smaller the firm.
Okay.
And when I became a sole practitioner 16 years in, that was when I really found that I liked not having to be accountable to somebody else for what we're going to charge clients or that kind of thing. That's something that is not appreciated by big firm lawyers, is they've got a rate sheet. When they meet a client, they've got to follow that rate. They don't have any individual choice. Where for me, as a sole practitioner, I don't...
You're the boss.
Yeah, so if I see a client that I want to take on and they can't afford the rate that I was expecting to get, I can make a decision to not have to account for it. That's hard to do even in a two-person partnership, where your partner's going to say, what are you doing? You can't undersell our business. We've got a standard to keep.
So what's the hierarchy? You go in as the clerk and then associate, and then hope for a partner?
Yeah, the big firm life is very fierce. It's changed in recent years. There was a big disruption in the legal industry 10 years ago. But historically, in big firm life, it's a kind of a pyramid scheme where every partner has two or three associates working for them. And you can't make them all partner, because you would grow bigger than your client base has. So you have 7 years as an associate, and after that, about half or slightly more will be offered a partnership, and they'll be set financially for a very long time, and the other half are let go. Okay. And when you think it is so competitive, most of the people in that field have not experienced failure, at least not academic or professional failure, at any time in their career. And then they may be doing stellar work, but because there's a finite number of seats open, they experience the first real failure in life around the age of 32 or so. And it's devastating, although they land on their feet generally. They go off to another firm and may not make the same kind of money, but
it's meant to eliminate.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very much like the management consulting world, or the big, management consulting firms of the world, pyramid system.
Very much like that.
They let the universities trim out the, they get the best of the best.
Yeah.
How many hours does an associate have to bill out a year? What's the expectation back in, that time frame?
Back in that day, it was about 2,000 to 2,200 hours a year was pretty typical.
Okay. What is it today? Do you know?
I think it's softened a little bit for many firms. Okay. Yeah, but it has gotten worse and acceptable, not worse, higher. Acceptable for it to be higher at some large firms. And I'm not as in touch with that life as I once was. And the industry has changed a lot. Clients became more sophisticated, and law firms couldn't get away with the kind of unilateral decision making they once did. And there was a time when law firms weren't real clear in their billings on what the clients were paying for.
Yeah.
One of the most prestigious firms, for years, their bills had one line for services rendered, and then there'd be a 7-digit figure. And it was considered improper for a client to hire two law firms. They put all their business with one firm. And around the 1980s, clients just got more sophisticated in handling legal services, so they would hire two law firms. And when they'd get a really good relationship with one, they'd go to the other one and say, how come you're not offering us the same deal the other one did? They'd play them off against each other, and it just became much, much more competitive. And then the legal industry has always grown year over year. Even during the Great Depression, legal services grew every year during that time until 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And to an extent, big law firms are something of a pyramid scheme that only can exist because the market always grew. And it shrunk then. Some law firms that were 150 years old collapsed during that time.
Yeah.
And what has changed is you don't automatically become an equity partner if you survive 7 years as an associate. So firms have varying degrees of equity and non-equity partnership, which is an odd term. A non-equity partner seems
Right.
to be a little contradictory.
Right.
But for very good reason now, you generally do not get equity in the firm unless you can drive business to the firm. That was not always the case. There was a time when in a big firm, some people, because they just had great legal skills, would be accepted as a partner, even though by nature of their personality or social drive, they never brought in any business. And
So
let the firm just absorb it.
This is it's a competitive thing in law school. It's a competitive thing when Brandon, my son, he was going to be a lawyer. And I think really driven from probably suits. And, it's like, hey, Porsche, corner office, who does, in our neighborhood, there was a lot of lawyers. They seem to be doing really well. Why not? And when, and we had said, okay, we've got regulars, we got college, but for law school, you're going to participate in that. You're going to have to go in with us on that. And we set him up to meet with some partners that we knew at some big firms, and they talked him out of it. And they said, most of these guys said, if I had to do it over again, the number of hours, the life that and these were older guys. Yeah. The life that we lived back then is totally different. Like I wouldn't be an associate. They talked him out of it, and that's how he said, I'm going to be an entrepreneur, and I was like, oh no, don't do that.
Well, a lot has changed in the industry over the years, and I think the common theme is that clients are just better consumers of legal services, and they navigate this a lot better than they used to be. The old system with the big firms was you would go to a firm because you had an issue come up, like a tax matter. Right. And once you're in the system, they would cross-sell services in other areas, like litigation, securities regulation, that kind of thing. That's not necessarily in the client's best interest. A firm may be great in one department, but you could get better services in another issue, a lower-cost firm. So the trend has been fewer large firms, although the large firms that are there are much bigger than they used to be. There was a time when you would consider, in my lifetime, when you would consider 400 people to be a large firm. Right. Now there are some firms, like the largest one is, I think, 6,000 attorneys. Wow. If not 6,000 partners.
As a result of some mergers?
Yeah, and the one reason why there always needs to be a big firm is if you have a multi-jurisdiction issue, like you're selling a product in 50 countries, they can be efficient to be with a law firm that has offices in 50 countries, or at least knowledge of the law in that many countries. But for the most part, you probably get better services on your issue if you go to a firm that's narrowly tailored to that issue. Right. And chances are that's going to be a firm that does not have 500 attorneys. It's probably going to be one that has between 10 and 100 attorneys. Mm-hmm. And then it's changing at the bottom level as well because technology has caught up with law. Yeah. In fact, I started as a big firm attorney, and probably a third of what I did in my first year of law practice is not done by human beings anymore. It's just the click of a button on a computer, and all that work is covered now.
Well, there's always a shift of technology, and then a shift of buyer journey. And so you could end up being a Sears in an Amazon world, and there's no industry that's exempt from that. But I can remember the first time we used a big major law firm. We were I had an Inc. 500 company, so we were high flying. We wanted a franchise, and we went to a big. We thought we had a smaller attorney, but there's something about when you hit a certain point, and you go, we're going with where the big guys go. And so I could just remember walking into their lobby, and we felt like, oh, we've made it. Look, we're here at this big law firm.
Yeah.
You know? And the partner in charge of the franchises came out. He was just this nice guy, and we met with him a bunch of times. Well, you know, I don't know if this is on purpose or just with us, but the first bills were like almost nothing, and so you're like, oh yeah, you know? And then you start getting the ones that are coming in later, and I remember thinking, please don't be thinking about it. You know, do you have to make copies of everything?
Yeah.
But you're really right. When you get into litigation, then you meet this guy. It's like one big family, and then, you know, and but you know, it was a positive experience. It was a positive experience, but you know, boy, it sure.
Well,
It was a ton of money.
Another interesting change was at one time your address was very important. That to prove that you were a law firm to be taken seriously, you had to have a prestigious address, and the rents matched that value. But about the time the internet came along, with the whole .com boom of the first part of the century, younger clients were unimpressed by addresses, and they would think, why spend money just to pay for you to have a fancy address when we really don't care where you work. We care about what you work on.
Right.
And location does not matter as much anymore. And that's impacted the practice of law as well.
How has like Silicon Valley and the type of issue? You know, I have some friends that one guy was a partner of the patent at a major law firm famous for winning the tobacco cases, and he was at the top of the and him and a group left to open up their own boutique firm, and we knew him before, and we used to. I was turning around an ad agency. We used to create the images that they show in trial, but they had to be done in such a way, really plain Jane, so a complicated concept could be understood by the jury, but it couldn't be flashy or anything that it would. You know, I forget. You know, we had to get coached into doing all this, and so I was turning around an advertising agency that brought these guys in, but what a drastic difference when they opened up it was like a tech firm, and all of a sudden these guys went from Brooks Brothers to they looked like Silicon Valley, venture capitalists. It's just their world, but you could tell it was a shift of technology. And now their clients are all these tech firms that were just, full of venture capital, had lots of money to spend, and it was just like, a whole new world. The shift, and so, and their offices didn't look like, it looked like you were walking into a tech firm.
Yeah, it's strange the impact that Silicon Valley has had on law practice. In fact, average salaries, which is something of a measure of the size and heft of the legal community, average salaries in Silicon Valley are higher than in San Francisco. And that's odd, because 40 years ago, we kind of thought of that area down by Palo Alto as the suburbs. San Francisco was always called the city, and there was no doubt about what you're talking about when you referred to the city. And it would seem like if you weren't working in the city, you were in kind of a backwater area. And now salaries in Silicon Valley, particularly those serving the venture capital world, they're actually higher than they are in Manhattan and higher than in LA and San Francisco. So it's a very refined market, but that's an astounding change.
So you're in big law firm. You decide to go out on your own. Now you're really in entrepreneur waters. Because before, you weren't paying rent. You weren't, you had all these, whatever you had. What was the biggest shocker of you hanging up your?
Oh, it's how few hours you bill as a solo practitioner. In a big firm, you're generally expected to bill about 8 hours a day.
Okay.
And often you've got to be in the office for 10 to 12 hours to do the 8.
Okay.
And in a small firm, especially when I was small enough that I didn't have support staff, billing 4 hours in a day was a pretty good day. And I was shocked by that. I thought I was just not a very forceful attorney. And then I talked to others and found out that's actually pretty typical. And now actually the law practice management software companies, since it's all in the cloud, they monitor usage. And I believe the average sole practitioner, the latest stats, bills 2.9 hours a day.
Wow.
And that's strange because the self-perception is what one does for a living is one sits at a desk and bills out their time, when in fact most of the day is spent doing all kinds of things that actually don't directly result in a bill going to a client.
So has digital changed the law library?
Oh, profoundly.
So do you, who made the books?
Well, the two big publishers are West and Lexis.
Okay, Lexis.
And West was the big one. They go back to the 1870s.
Wow.
And they actually changed legal philosophy by publishing every opinion that was out.
Wow.
You know, for the first time in history, you could compare decisions in one part of the country from another. So West is a big part of legal history.
Wow.
And they were an early innovator with online research. And now it's rare to do research in actual books.
Wow.
Because the power of searching is just so much greater.
Right.
Sure.
So do you have the law, the beautiful law library still in law firms, or is that kind of?
They're only for having pictures taken in front of them.
Really? Isn't that something?
And they're rare. They're because law space is is expensive.
Yep.
They gladly got rid of those.
So Church Law Center, Newport Beach. It's not
Yeah.
like you picked the cheapest place in town.
It was just home.
It was home.
So it made sense.
So we've looked at your website. Very cool, very forward thinking. We've looked at your social strategy, different things like that.
Yeah.
You look like, and one of the first things I was like, oh boy, this guy's on top of everything. What's it like? I mean, you have to be a practitioner of the law. You have to be, but then you have to be a marketer. You have to, you didn't have to do that at the big law firm. Somebody else did that. How did you learn how to do all this stuff?
Most of it was trial and error.
Okay.
And it helped that I've been doing it a long time. For all the marketing that goes on, still the biggest source of business is referrals.
Okay.
From those that have done business with me before, and word gets out. So I always inquire of new clients.
Okay.
And most come in through referrals, and those are the ones that last the longest time.
And you're doing church law, not-for-profit, and higher education? Are those
Yeah,
the three?
it's nonprofit organizations generally.
Okay.
So probably a third to half of the work is religious organizations, most of them churches, some at the denominational level, some at the local church level, a lot of ministries. And then because political organizations and trade associations are nonprofit organizations, I do work for them as well. And higher education is kind of in a time of flux.
Mm-hmm.
So that's an increasing part of our work. Higher ed is also a nonprofit field. So there's unique aspects to how nonprofit organizations are structured. And most lawyers don't do both for-profit and nonprofit because the dynamic is just very, very different.
Yeah, I'll say.
Having a profit motive is very different from having a service motive. And the boards of nonprofit organizations just operate differently. While similar laws apply, the board function is just very, very different in a nonprofit organization.
Yeah, the goal is different.
Yeah,
I mean,
and to give one example, I think will make sense when you think about it. But in most for-profit organizations, to serve on a board, you have to have a lot of business experience. And chances are you've served on small boards before you served on a large board.
Mm-hmm.
In a church, many board members, if not all of them, have never served on a board before. So 100% of what they learn about how a board operates is from more senior board members who had never served on any other board before. So we very frequently encounter really unique practices in a church or ministry board where they do something that's just very odd, and they believe every board does that. And it's not the case. So it's always interesting to encounter those.
Yeah, I mean, the first time I sat on a nonprofit board, the whole Robert's Rules of that was all.
Yeah.
You know, and I had only been on advisory boards for for-profit businesses, and I got in that world, and I was just like, oh my gosh, what formality! I mean, I don't think our lawyers filled out stuff for us, and then but we never really did any of this, and they did it.
Well, one of the things that we deal with a lot when you mention Robert Rules of Order is advising churches on how to have a parliamentary procedure system that works, that doesn't give everybody anxiety. And it's not easy, but a lot of people pick up things they heard you've got to do somewhere because
we've always done it this way.
We've always done it this way. And so we try to get churches to relax on this issue and get a stronger sense of what really matters and make sure that you carry that out and not be so concerned about the other matters.
Do you consider yourself running a law firm as an entrepreneur as well as a lawyer?
Oh, very much so.
Okay.
It has the same problems that any business has, where you've got to worry about making payroll and have to deal with the insurance issues you face. If a competitor comes along, that's got to be a matter of concern as well. The one area that is not like many other businesses is there is a degree of collegiality. It mystifies me to some extent that lawyers would come together in conferences and disclose all their secrets of how they're succeeding in things. They're very proud of that fact. That, that's one of the rewards, is that people actually listen to you in how you succeeded in something. And undeniably, I am doing things that I would not have thought of on my own, but I heard competitors say, here's how we succeeded, and I followed that path and succeeded as well.
Did you ever think you weren't going to make it? Was there ever a time in your business where you left the big firm, you start the small firm, and if you don't have enough clients, it wasn't as if you're a good lawyer. It's if I don't get enough clients, can I really do this and support my family?
It has not been ascending the heights from one success to another. It's been a very rocky road along the way.
Okay.
And I worked for many firms. Most of them are not in business anymore.
Okay.
Not because I destroyed them, but after I left, a period of time would come when they would go out of business, and it's just a very fluid area. And I made some missteps. I've been asked to leave firms, and others that I've left. I stayed too long, and didn't realize till after I'd left that I would have been a much healthier person emotionally if I had left early on, but I had deceived myself into thinking it was worth enduring anything to remain at this firm.
How has your faith helped you make it through those tough times? And the toughest times that you can think of as an entrepreneur in your practice, how has your faith helped?
It has. I think the biggest challenge to a Christian attorney is time related. I almost said time management, and I don't want to reduce one's walk with God to a time exercise, but this is not unique to law. You would have known this in your businesses, but when you're faced with a client issue where the stakes are really high, like suppose a client will lose millions of dollars or be kicked out of their house if you lose, you have to make their concern a higher priority than some of the stuff that you would prefer to do. And that includes church activities. That comes into play. That you generally don't find a lot of professional people involved in those church activities that are the most leisurely paced. You're far more likely to have them come in. In fact, it is easier to get a lawyer to take a day off to pound out 12 hours of solid work at a church than it would be to get a lawyer to commit 1 hour a week to carrying out a function, because they'll always do the triage of what's the most important way to spend the hour, and they just can't make it that hour. Easier to block out a massive period of time and just put everything you have into that, because that's kind of the way that law practice trains you anyway. So I was not prepared for how busy I was going to be as a lawyer, and I was not active in my faith as a law student. And I continued that in law practice. And 6 years in, I got sick, was laid up for 9 weeks. And it just made me rethink everything that I had gone through in my life thus far. And I had a lot of sorrow over what I felt I had lost in the 6 or 7 years that I had not been faithfully reading scripture or praying. I hadn't rejected the faith, but I was doing nothing to advance it either.
Right, right, right.
And that was quite a come down from somebody who was in ministry previously. So over the span of that 9-week period of time, I pulled out a lot of old books that I had not read in a very long time. And it developed a kind of zeal for serving God that I had not experienced before in memory. And that has generally stayed with me. There have been some lean patches in there, but for the most part, since that time, 6 years in, I have not drifted away without hitting a point where I think I've got to realign things greater. One of the big challenges of wanting to practice the presence of God is when you have a job that requires great concentration, you can only have one thing going on in your mind at a time, and it's easy to lose sight of that. And I remember I had a blotter on my desk, and I drew a big cross, and that was going to be my reminder. Today is the day I am going to think on my walk with God, to have a sense of His presence all day long. I've failed the last 500 days, but today is the day. And then the first phone call comes in, particularly if it's an angry phone call, and then it's gone. So the next day I come in and say, today is the day, this is the day it's going to happen. And I remember getting discouraged, but I have actually found, I think as part of the aging process, I just have a greater sense of God's involvement in everything all the time. And even though I still have those moments when I am on the phone in the midst of an intense conversation, I am not thinking of my role in God's universe at that moment, but I'm not far from it. And I don't know that I could be where I am today if it wasn't for having a lot of years of doing this. Do you remember the book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction? I can't think of the author offhand. It might have been Eugene Peterson.
Oh, okay.
But I think that kind of is the measure, that maturity means that some things that were really difficult to do at one point, you develop an ability to follow them. And I do pray continually that God sustains this kind of growth and that I don't experience a really lean period again. But I think for lawyers in particular, not unique to law, but certainly a big issue for lawyers, it's the different attitude towards time. How do you transcend that so that your walk with God is not something that you schedule and say, I'm giving God 3/10 of an hour, because lawyers think in tenths of hours.
You know, that's interesting, because I think with so many businesses, if you're not billing, if you're billing out per hour, then that is a whole mindset.
Yeah.
You're very aware of what you're doing with your time.
Yeah.
But if you're in a corporate America and you get a paycheck, you're not really thinking about hours. In fact, you may be thinking about putting in the fewest number of hours.
Yeah.
But you don't have this pressure. So that's a whole different way of thinking.
I think in all the professions that bill by the hour, there has always been a knowledge of productivity that is harder to see in other disciplines. So.
Is honesty an issue is there a pressure for lawyers to overbill to meet their...
Well, a lot of that does happen, and you read in the legal press about gross disproportionate billing, and it's certainly a temptation. I think for the average lawyer, they need to work through how they're going to bill early on, and after 3 or 4 years you don't think about it very much. But there's some horrific stories reported in the press, and I do remember working in a firm where a partner billed for depositions that she never took. And that was kind of my first-hand experience, so this really does happen.
I always thought when I'd get a call from, I've developed some really good friendships with lawyers that were, but I'd say, are we on the clock He said, "We're on the clock. I'm going to make this a really,
Yeah.
But it's kind of a humorous thing. Most of the people that we run into at Cana are business people, entrepreneurs, small business CEOs, and really their connection is they've gotten stuck.
Yeah.
And so, regardless of their background, they've reached this place where all of a sudden they want to start connecting these dots between business, purpose. They want purpose in their life. They still want to be successful, but they also want to be successful with God.
Yeah.
And then their faith. And really, these dots have been unconnected, and they want them to be connected. And so, when I've done interviews or when we interview people, it's the backstories that are always interesting, because most of the people that come to us are stuck, and it's in that moment where they rediscover.
Yeah.
In some sense. And
Right.
and most have never given up on God. It's just they're not spending time with him, I think, is the thing.
Yeah.
And so, okay, so how do you become dean of a law school?
I think I've been an employee here longer than anyone else, so that may have come up. I started teaching my second year out of law school as an adjunct professor here at Trinity.
Okay.
And I stayed with it, other than a couple of breaks along the way. It has been the longest sustained commitment outside of my marriage that I've been a part of. So I've been associated with the school for 29 years.
Wow.
You like teaching. You enjoy that whole interaction.
Oh, very much so. And actually, I think most lawyers do like that. That they look back. Law school used to be a lot more brutal than it is now. There was a lot of professors having students stand up and the professor to humiliate them. And so all those students, when they become lawyers, they long to be reversing that role and experience that. So a lot of lawyers enjoy teaching. And I was grateful to have the opportunity that just kind of landed without my looking for it. And I enjoyed it so much that I was thrilled when I was asked to come back again and again. And ultimately became a full-time professor and aspired to leadership position. It was one of the challenges with litigation is you come on the scene after the disaster has happened.
Right.
And it's cleanup work. So there's not a lot of opportunity to look, what can you accomplish in the future? Can you set a goal 20 years down the road and work your way towards it? So being in an administrative position is just a wonderful change of pace.
Yeah.
And we have unique challenges as a Christian law school in thinking through what the implications of the faith are. And strangely, we are more rooted in the history of law than non-Christian law schools are, because our legal system developed out of an understanding by a culture that faith was important to regulation of human behavior. And there was a rift that started in the mid-19th century where people started to see law as not being about faith, and it's increasingly grown in our society. One of the great things that we have here at Trinity is deep-rootedness. We train our students in the philosophy of law to help them sort out for themselves that how do you really define justice? What's the source of it? And that's just a marvelous thing. It's wonderful to talk to students in the hallway that are passionate in getting their questions answered about these matters, and it's a marvelous experience.
What's the biggest challenge of being a law school today, but then a Christian law school? And so when the students are picking their law, what is the greatest challenge of, I guess, admissions and getting people in?
Well, I think there is a tendency for people to think of legal education as a trade school where you're learning the mental equivalent of a physical skill. That in the same way that you learn to be a craftsman working with wood or metal, you're learning skills on how to carry out factors in court. And most people think there's really not much that morality has to do with this, when the opposite is the case, that the foundation for why we do things the way we do them is just hugely important. And it's overlooked even by a lot of lawyers, that the way we define justice and determining the best way to come to a good solution you really have to know why you're doing things the way that you do them in order to sort through that. And we do a marvelous job with our faculty here at Trinity in getting students to think through, why is the law the way it is? And is it really carrying out justice? How do you move things forward in a way that draws people to flourishing as human beings rather than tearing them apart?
Is there a
That's good.
positive or negative stereotype of graduating from a Christian law school and then going out into the workforce?
There can be. We are not a prestigious school by the standards of the ranking of schools, and we're accredited by the California State Bar, not the American Bar Association, which is a different accrediting.
So you would need to practice here in...
You have to practice in California.
Okay.
And our graduates do not go on to big law firms. They go to smaller practices.
Okay.
But some kinds of practices are mostly done by small firms, that estate planning, family law, small business type work tends to be done by smaller firms rather than large firms, and our students aspire to that. At Trinity, we have always had a strong emphasis on human rights, and we were founded in 1980, and we had a human rights master's degree as part of the school back then. That was extraordinarily unusual for evangelicals to care about human rights back then. And that's continued to be a big interest here. And part of our desire is to turn out students that will have some involvement in trying to make society more just outside of just the work that you have with individual clients. And I think we do a good job at that. It's not easy work, but I think the number of our students that have made a difference in different areas of life for people is great.
How do you envision, what do you see in the next 5-10 years of the legal community changing? What do you see in your binoculars?
Technology has continued to make a big change. I think most of us in law thought until 10 years ago that this was an area that will not be impacted by technology.
Yeah.
But artificial intelligence is doing some amazing things in law. So that's going to change the nature of experience. It's more competitive in a sense that it is easier for consumers to figure out what legal services will cost. And do-it-yourself legal programs have made a profound distinction. So it's difficult for the recent law school graduate. There was a time when you could leave law school, open a small person's office, and take in a lot of work that would just come in the door, and that would give you enough money to survive until you developed a specialty. And that opportunity just doesn't exist anymore, that you can't just do the simple wills and simple divorces and simple contracts while you wait to develop a specialty. Students need to be far more competitive in figuring out what direction they're going to take their careers before they leave law school.
How does...
I was going to ask you, so what you mean by that is that are there, you got to be more of a specialty coming right out of school? Is that what you're saying?
Well, that would be ideal, but the typical law school graduate is 25 years old and does not have a career background as such. So their best opportunity is to make networking connections, perhaps something that's related to their undergraduate degree, to join groups that have a common interest, develop a greater expertise in some other areas, and use that to be a launching pad to join a firm where they're going to get trained in the specialty. That it does mean that solo practices are replaced more with 2 or 3 person practices, because it's just harder to step out on your own. And we're speaking mostly of big cities. It's a little bit different in smaller counties.
How has the whole co-working kind of environment hit? You know, it's hit every other industry. The big consulting firms, you know, many of them have kind of there's floors where there's space and you rent your, you know, you go in, I'm in Chicago, I reserve a space. But you're starting to see a lot of them go into co-working spaces and do meetings. Has that hit the law firms yet?
It has, in a huge way. And we haven't seen the end of it yet. And it's controversial. One of Canada's big firms, when their Vancouver office came up for lease renewal, they went into something that looks more like a typical WeWork kind of place, where attorneys aren't assigned offices. They mostly work at benches. And if you need the privacy of an office, you go and reserve it for a period of time. And the newer attorneys love it. The older ones feel like there's a tremendous loss of status.
Oh, yeah, that has to be.
And because of our church-related business and the ministry business, we've got a kind of conservative client base. And we looked into using one of those facilities, and it just didn't seem like a fit for our clients, from the receptionist in overalls, the kombucha on tap. I just thought our clients are going to think, I came to the wrong place for this. So we didn't do it. But then one of my competitors in San Francisco has a 3-person office in a WeWork space. And I went up there to see it, just to see how it worked. And it worked marvelously for them.
Oh, yeah. I don't,
Sure.
But at some cost. For me, the one thing that I can't figure out in that environment is, how do you handle an incoming call that's going to be sensitive
yeah.
without putting the person on hold for a few minutes while you go find one of those little phone booth rooms. And the reality, though, is with more lawyers working from home or on the road, you can't justify paying $4 a square foot for an office that may be actually physically occupied for no more than 16 hours
Right.
in a week. So the trend has been shifting to make the support staff space a little nicer, since they are there all that time, and the attorneys have to check out space to use.
So that has even hit the, on Curb Your Enthusiasm, there's an episode where some very wealthy guy goes into a lawyer, and it's Casual Friday.
Yeah.
And the guy, and he's getting referred to this guy, and this is like a billionaire type guy that goes in, and he's just like, what? And it's what's the movie star's name? Anyway, he was so appalled by the attorneys. He says, I'm out of here. I want to go someplace where I want my lawyer in a tie.
Yeah,
and all that. But it was, I imagine with technology, and so what are the big? Do you see big shifts like that with real estate and all that hitting the?
Yeah, I think that's going to continue.
Okay.
And it is easier to practice law from home than it used to be. Back when I started my career and would have to put in some long nights, it's a little intimidating to be the only person working in a high-rise building. So if I could have worked at home, I would have. But you just couldn't. You need your files, you need the books, and all that's gone now. You can be as productive anywhere.
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of attorneys are not doing that regular commute and are happier. The one part that I don't think can be compensated for is the training of new lawyers. If they don't have the ability to just pop their head in a partner's office, say, I'm stuck, can you help me? That's a big loss. And
so this is interesting, because this is, in our next topic that we get into, it's really, there's digital community and analog in-person communities. So, it's like my wife works for General Electric. She works from home. She's in charge of professional development for the Americas. And all the people at her level, they all work from home. Now, sometimes they have offices. When we were in Wisconsin, they had this huge center, but it was a ghost town because nobody would go in. So it's interesting, and this is corporate America. This is getting done. So it has to, but there is something about when you don't have walking down the hall to your office and saying, hey, Scott, do you have a minute? You kind of, and I think that, I'm 58 years old, so I kind of still like that.
Yeah.
But the ones coming up are just used to, my son, when he graduated from Vassar, that's where he went to school, I asked him, I says, and he came to live with us, and I says, hey, Brandon, do you miss your friends? And he goes, no, what they do, I was so surprised, I didn't know this. They're on some kind of online thing, definitely not Facebook, but they're on with each other almost 24/7. So when they're at work, they're talking to their friends. They're in some kind of, and this is like what they all do. And he says, oh no, we used to do it when we were, 2 doors down in the dorm.
Yeah.
And I remember in our turnaround firm, we had this open area, and our new guys would have to sit in that open, like bullpen kind of thing. And we hired some younger ones, and this was 10 years ago or even longer. And I got so mad one day because this is when instant message came, came, and they're instant messaging each other. They're like sitting right next to each other, and I was just like, "Don't you guys can't you just turn and talk? What do you?" But
well, the part that I see this as an issue is as a young associate, if you've made a mistake, it's a little bit easier to just pop your head in a partner's office and say, I need some help. I think I screwed up on something here, and I'd kind of like you to help me out. That can be a pretty relaxed conversation, and the fact that you're eyeball to eyeball means the partner's probably not going to go nuts. On the other hand, if you're at home and you call your supervisor, the mere fact that you are taking your supervisor's phone time is setting this up in a formal relationship. It's a little harder to just meander into the issue then. You got to get down to business right away. And because that's intimidating, it probably won't happen. And rather, the young attorney is going to stumble along and not get that kind of oversight. I've seen that happen.
yeah,
And I think also a lot of time face-to-face, I've learned how to manage relationships. Like when you have a client that is getting upset, often for good cause, you learn how to fix that by having been in the same situation and totally messed it up before. And undeniably, it is the case that when your primary communication is by texting, you don't learn the nuances of how to smooth things over. And that's a reality for all of us. That's not unique to law.
Yeah.
But law does tend to create a lot of opportunities where you're bumping heads with other people, and if you don't know how to finesse it, it's going to get worse. And I see that happen.
Everything, it's digital's taking over everything, and it's just more and more and more so. And we were just saying, there's a guy I have a 2-hour conversation with every Friday morning, except this morning, and it occurred to me, so that we've been doing this for 2.5 years. He does turnarounds like I have, and he's a Kingdom guy. We have these, Benson. I've never met him. He's one of my best friends. I just realized that the other day, that how interesting that wouldn't have ever been possible.
Yeah.
I have a Monday call that I do, a Zoom call. You ever done a Zoom call?
Oh yeah.
So a year ago I never did Zoom calls. But I'm doing Zoom calls, and so every Monday I have a Zoom call. And so it's really interesting as we transition into next topic, which is church and the changes. When I look at my life and the things that we're doing, one of the things that we've struggled with as an organization is we reach people from all over the world. In the last 5 months, we've reached over 5,000 people from Africa.
Wow.
That I showed you an email yesterday from that was from the Middle East someplace, and
oh yeah, are you supposed to say where it's from? It's like,
yeah, we can, and
oh,
but
can you?
yeah.
Some of those places we really
well,
shouldn't
maybe
say.
not. Yeah, this is
We
true. If
shouldn't
it's
be
in
saying.
Pakistan, we have a guy from Pakistan that says, don't say you know us.
Yeah.
But it's changed. But we know that people still want analog. So how do you balance this mix? And so that brings us to really part 2 of this interview. And if you have any final questions for the first part, Scott, dig in there. But this is really about church reimagined. So what's so cool about getting to sit in front of you today? One, it was wonderful to hear your story. It was wonderful to hear about you as the entrepreneur, and then you in this profession that you've been into, and then also like a dean. How often do you get to meet a dean? So that's pretty fun for us.
I didn't do well in school. I didn't. The deans never really wanted to hang out.
we just my cousin sent me a text just this week, and our principal at Whittier Christian High School, which, you know, as we were in terror of this guy. I mean, he had the paddle with all the holes, Mr. Shed. And so he says, I found Mr. Shed on Facebook. And, you know, and we were young rebels, you know. And I text him, I says, find out where he lives. Do you want to go over and beat him up? You know? But it's so funny. You look at the man now, and it's like, you know, he's a great grandfather. He's such. He looks like our endearing. But you know, as a kid growing up, he was like,
Yeah.
you know, he had the paddle. So let's talk a little bit. You're a church law attorney. The church, as we know it, it's always evolved. I mean, if we look at I brought a copy of this book with Ed Silvoso, Ecclesia, and this is probably one of the top books out there of people are reading today that are reimagining church. So church has evolved. It has, in America, it's really, if we look at the studies from Barna, if we look at the studies from Lifeway, you know, there's big question marks about how outside our church bubble, how relevant are we? There's talk of the 7 mountains in society. Let's see if we know them, Scott. Business, government, education, arts and entertainment, media, religion, and family. Boom.
Yeah,
We forget half the time.
You got 'em all.
We forget.
That's very impressive.
Yeah. And so, you know, in times of the Bible, in the Bible times, a king many times wouldn't make a move without a prophet. Mm-hmm. And God was, and his influence in a society was, you know. So today you look at the business community and you go, we make all kinds of decisions. When do we ever invite the pastor in, except maybe some kind of prayer?
Yeah.
So there's that issue. There's a lot of innovation going on, and I think there always has been. And the new innovators are always, you know, the new heretics. And, you know, when I read stories I just read a great book, What If, from Tommy Barnett with the Dream Center and all. And so a lot of the things that they did in the early days, they were called heretics. Now that those things would be so old-fashioned today that
Yeah,
nobody,
yeah.
you know. And but you know, they're doing great things. So Scott, we did a video sometime back, you know, State of Church, and we did a bunch of research. Do you remember the figure that the church had spent? It was $1 billion.
$530 billion over 20 years, and
Tell us
there's
about
even
that.
less Christians. Well, just that. It's like, you know, we feel like that's what brought us together. It's like I just feel like we're struggling. We got the greatest message in the world. There's no other message that's greater than a relationship with Jesus Christ. And he wants to be a part of every part of our lives, not just whether you show up to church on Sunday. So really for us, it's like we're not doing a great job at the best message ever. So how do we change that? What do we need to do in order to really reach a 21st century person?
Yeah.
What do you do to make a 21st century church reach a 21st century person? So that's what we're looking at. And you're looking at you're talking about digital and analog, and I mean, we're looking at all these things. Well, what do we need to do in order to reach a generation that really looks at the church as irrelevant?
And trying to remember, 100 to 200 churches closing their doors
From 100 to 200
every week.
Yeah.
It's a lot. So, you know, I think about all those pastors that have sunk their life into this thing, and they've kind of got left behind. Whatever the new model is, they missed it. You know, they're too late for skinny jeans and tattoos and a tight T-shirt.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and you know, now they're sitting on real estate with 30 people that are all gray hair, and their lives are disintegrating. So you have that. Barna says, I think it's Barna, one of the research firms says less than 5% of Christians have made the Bible the center of their life. And then less than 10% read it on a regular basis. My experience, 20 years ago, I made a decision as a businessman, as an entrepreneur, that if somebody asked me why I'm successful, I'm no longer just going to make them think that it's because I'm so smart or something else. I was going to just say, you know, it's God. any ideas that I've had have really come from him. I mean, all my market, when I'm doing turnarounds, I'm praying, Lord, give me the wisdom to turn around this company so they won't have to lay off and all these families get, and I'm asking him, give me the wisdom. James 1:5 says we can go to you for, give me the wisdom so I could do my job. I decided I'm just going to tell people. And if I lose clients over it, I don't care. And I kind of just, you know, I kind of just thought I was at a place where, you know, I was sought after in some ways, and I thought I could kind of get away with it. Well, it changed everything. And when I first got into ministry, I was struck by, though most people believe God has a plan and purpose, very few people could tell you what it is. And I thought, well, that's, if he has one, isn't it odd that we don't know what it is? I mean, the pastors seem to know their calling. Shouldn't we know ours? Yeah. And can we be more than parking lot attendant, children's ministry? You know, can we get? Is there something more to life than the helps in that? Mm-hmm. And the first time we launched a ministry was in Indiana. We're just entrepreneurs. So we don't know any, you know, we are kingdom minded. We're the Bible, God, it's everything to us. But the group of us that did it, we just said, we didn't have any rules, or we weren't going for permission slips from anybody to do it. We used our own money, so we didn't have to raise money. Yeah. And we did this outreach in Indiana for 9 months, and we just we took a college marketing admissions kind of thinking behind it, which those were a lot of our turnarounds. Yeah. And so we really know that market very well. And it worked. And we brought in so many people. And we built, in our first 9 months, 3,000 people went through 10 2-hour Saturday. So they had to come 10 Saturdays in a row, 2 hours. Everybody said, you can't hold people 2 hours. It was a discipleship program that we built. Now, we didn't tell them it was a discipleship program. Yeah. We said, do you want to, it was about learning your purpose. And then we've learned to get really good at introducing the Bible right away, like we do today. Yeah. People come in at Cana on any kind of event, we have different topics that they come in, and they're all stuck. We know it, and we say, if God were offering help, would you take it? And then we always ask the audience, what would you call the person who's stuck, God's offering help, but they won't take it? And it takes how many seconds, and they say what every time? Oh, an idiot. No Somebody says an idiot, and that opens.
Sometimes you use
this is true. This is true. So there are the church in some ways, and I think it always. When we go through church history, and I go to Scott as the, he's been a pastor for such a long time, and you grew up as a youth pastor, and worked your way up in the ranks, and you've had the schools and all the different things that can go along with that kind of model. But the church has really become a Sears in some ways, not all, but the stats show us in an Amazon world. And I always think of Sears because I love Sears. I love their candy store. I love their hardware. We all had the catalogs, for, even though this isn't R-rated, but for a lot, but, it was, their catalogs were, I think it was the early days of pornography for a lot of young kids in the 50s, They were, they owned it. Yeah. They had more money than the smartest people. How did they miss it? Best Buy, we can just go through them. But, and the IBMs have had to do their turnarounds. Mm-hmm. Apple's had to do, GE. Everybody at some point, the thing that gets you there doesn't keep you there, and you have to be willing to reinvent. And the old guard doesn't want to change. They just don't want to change.
It's kind of like people saying, it's like, well, I just don't understand why they don't come in. Right? You get the older people in church like, well, we just have such a great church. We don't know why people won't come in. It's like, well, so maybe we should change the way we're doing this.
There's all these, and what he does, when he takes us back to the days of Jesus in the New Testament church, and Barna did this with the book Pagan Christianity. They put out a controversial book some time back that said, okay, in the first 300 years of the church, this is this is what it did. All these other things got added. Now, there's nothing wrong, but they weren't part of the New Testament church, so let's not make them sacred.
Yeah.
They have changed, and a lot of them really came from bad things, and then turned good later on. And so, you always joke about people that say, well, you know, the original text, the King James, you know.
Yeah, people actually tell me that. So, well, it's good enough for Jesus, it's good enough for me.
And Scott's told me some pastor stories that I'm just of when he just changed the simplest things. You know, people left, and so, you know, this is so there's all these fresh ways for people to gather, do church. There's a big theological debate going on right now of what is church. We're seeing mega churches really create online churches that are run totally independent, different staffs, with the intention of reaching communities that aren't within driving distance. And that are never going to go to church. And now being and so there's that. You have all kinds of different versions. We were looking at one. There's a church in the UK that's a coffee shop co-working and something else, and it really models exactly what was happening in Acts. But you wouldn't know you were walking in. That what they're doing is creating something that society already does, and then putting the gospel in it.
Are there things that you've seen that have intrigued you, as far as new ways to reach people for Christ, and new, just innovative ways that churches are, what are they doing?
Yeah, I've been surprised at how I think more could be done in social media than is being done in many ways. You know, we lament the time when pastors used to make house calls, and that era is never going to come back in our lifetime, because homes are considered private space, and that's intrusive. But those were random. They often didn't have a particular purpose. They fulfilled their purpose by merely existing. Is that the pastor and the family was supposed to interact, and there wasn't a script, there wasn't an agenda. We lost something when that went away. And we have not had a good vehicle for bringing that back until social media came along. I think it would strike a lot of people in the pew, as well as pastors, to think that a good part of the job is being readily available by text messaging throughout the day. That you know, if you know somebody's about to have a big job interview, or there's a crisis coming up, that there is a kind of ready communication that can be switched over from electronic means to audio, or even in person. But because it's hard to plan those ahead of time, I think that's the main reason, that you can't decide as a pastor, I'm going to be socially available between the hours of 9:30 and 11:30 on Tuesday.
Guys, I have a solution for this. I have a solution. The light bulb just came on right now.
Okay.
So in Chicago, at 1871, the big incubator that's out there, we were turning around a tech firm. And they had 3 locations: San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. You know what they used to do? They used to have these little robots. It's a camera and a screen. And they were like $3,000 or something like that. So they were parked, and if you were in another city, you could go hook into one, drive it anywhere you wanted within the office. So we'd be in an office like this. And, you know, and it would be, because you'd see Sue's face. And she's like, "Hi, guys." And, you know, it was very creepy. It was very creepy. But this is what, you know, this was a millennial-run company, and this is how they did it. But I was thinking about, as you were saying this, in medicine, you know, I mean, nowadays, if you got an issue, you can't do everything this way, but, you know, you go online, you tell the doctor, you know, whatever, and you get the prescription.
Oh, yeah.
So,
like that.
So, you know, maybe there'll be a pastor deal, Scott, where you could, where people could get pastor robots. You park it in, you know, someplace where they don't have access, unless you want them to have access. And then you can come, you know, hey, no, not so good? Maybe not? Okay, so here's the deal. So we have, I want to go through a couple different groups type of people that are trying to innovate right now. There are, and bring up some topics and really discuss what they're going to, there's a theological debate, and that's not for us, but that is going on. Like, what is church? What qualifies as church? And this is a battle that's going on right now. And you get on different church publications, and you see these coming up all the time. So there's a group of church plant innovators. And, there's all these church plant groups or organization, and it's usually made up of some of the brightest minds that have done some amazing things, and it's almost like a franchise kind of mentality.
Yeah.
And, you do these 10 things, and you go through this school, and we'll fund you, and then we take a percentage of what you bring in, and we fund other, and it's kind of this thing, and there's all kinds of different versions of them. And they have it's almost like in the startup world, VC. And they have a lot of success. So they're really pushing envelopes of, as long as we're not breaking the law, we'll do anything to win a soul. And without naming the name, we laughed at one of the third fastest growing church in America, who happens to have a Netflix series out right now. And all sorts of innovative things. But I read in one article, they wanted to put a prayer tent at I think it was at a non-Christian, it was at a concert or something like that. I don't remember the details. But they're thinking, how can we get people into our prayer tent? So they put beer kegs all the way around.
That should do it.
And it worked. Now, if you're from Milwaukee, it doesn't matter what denomination you're in. Right. Everybody's down with the brew. But in other parts, And so we have Kanye West Sunday services, big phenomena that's happening. Justin Bieber kind of following in some of those footsteps. And so there's questions. Well, are they a church, or is that something else? You have house churches. And certain, that's been around for a while, but there's some really successful, big ones that are spreading. There are small groups meeting. So there's all these there's churches and coffee shops. There's churches and co-working spaces. There's online churches. So there's a whole group of innovators that's just in their blood, and they're pushing the limits, and they're trying to reach people that the church are not reaching. So there's a theological debate, but then there's a legal thing. Yeah. There's a legal thing going on. And I know from being a business guy that first did ministry, and if you use your own money, you don't have to ask permission for anybody. You just go do it. Yeah. Right? I mean, you don't have to, we didn't worry about being even incorporated in any way. You could just go spend money, do something, and and get away with it. But then at some point, if you want to be a little bit more organized, and you call up a church attorney. First, it's hard to find one.
Yeah, they're not many.
How do you know who the good ones are? Okay, so it's when I'm looking for a litigator, I can go to somebody I know, and boom, right. But when I was talking about this, I just couldn't find anybody. Yeah. And then without naming names, when I found an organization to help us decide if we wanted to become, a 501c3 or a church or a paramedic or whatever, they weren't equipped for entrepreneurs because, we think differently. Yeah. We ask why. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so there's the church innovators. Then there's established churches. There's two groups. There's all these pastors. Scott's going to go speak, we won't say where, but in front of a big group soon, and then we're doing a conference later this year. And our heart really breaks for the pastor that has dedicated their whole life to this, and because there's a shift of technology and a shift of buyer journey, they're getting put to pasture. Mm-hmm. Most of them don't have retirement. There's most of them, they're sitting on a lot of owned property. Yeah. Their congregations are, almost dead. They're just disintegrating. So you got that group. If you can change their thinking, which is, that's going to be one thing. but they need to know, okay, well, what can we do? Because we're afraid of losing our tax exempt, our property, what is it? The
welfare exemption.
welfare exemption. So you have that. Then you have, so that's one group. Then you have the big churches that are used to pushing limits. And so, you saw churches building family life centers with full gymnasiums and workout centers. And, before, I was with one and we built a gigantic place. I mean, it rivaled anywhere, And coffee shops and cafes and bookstores and all these different things. And from a lot of these churches that are kind of like founder driven, where if they have a board, it's their friends.
Right.
But they've got 20,000 people showing up and they do whatever they want.
Yeah.
I don't know if they're checking with the lawyers.
Yeah.
So this is kind of our conversation. And so let's start with the innovators. If somebody like Kanye West or somebody's doing house churches, legally, what do you have to do legally to be a church?
It's actually easier than you might think.
Really good. Okay.
I think it is commonly known that tax exemption at the federal level is through Section 501c3 of the Revenue Code. So people think of charities as being 501c3s. There's a long, elaborate process in qualifying. You've got to fill a rather lengthy form for the most part. One exception is churches are by definition tax exempt under Section 501c3. So if you are a church, you are tax exempt federally.
No, you have to fill out all that. You still have to go through the paperwork?
No
you
paperwork.
Don't?
No paperwork.
So what is that called when they do that? They go, because I know some pastors that have gone that route, and do they fill out a form every year? Or?
No, there's no federal form. It can vary from state to state. If you incorporate, that raises some issues of state regulation. In California, for example, where we're talking, if you incorporate, you have to pay a franchise tax unless you get state exemption. And it's not as easy at the state level as it is at the federal level. But definitionally, if you are a church, then you are tax exempt under federal law. That raises the question, what is a church? And generally that's not the kind of thing we want to leave up to the state, but the IRS has to be able to know what a church is. So they have a list of characteristics that generally describe churches. And if you looked at the list, there's 14 different items. It sounds like it is describing a typical Protestant church. And that's kind of fed into it. And it's pretty easy for most Protestant churches to meet most, if not all, 14. And you don't have to meet all of them. You don't have to meet a majority of them. They just do the analysis of all of them and determine whether this is a church or not. And with some of the issues that we've talked about here, the way that technology has changed things, it's pushing the boundaries of that limit that would have described a church 200 years ago.
Right, because if you said what's a business, think about and how everything we've talked about, how digital's changed everything, how would that not affect how we gather?
I did have a challenge with one client that had an online church, and the IRS was troubled by the fact that there was no physical location. And they caused some hassles there. And as so often the case, challenging the IRS's initial ruling is expensive. And many will choose to yield even if the IRS is wrong.
Okay.
And my impression was that this fit every sense of being a church, but it didn't have a physical location. And at some point, somebody's going to be willing to challenge the IRS if they make a similar ruling again.
That's got to happen.
It's going to happen
in the next 5 years, I would say.
I would think so.
Because what we've seen the church go from, okay, let's minister online to bring people to our physical location.
Yeah.
And for a lot of good reasons. But then when they're reaching all over the country, and they're reaching people that aren't going to go anywhere else.
Yeah.
and they've created new models. I have a pastor friend that lives in Laguna Niguel that goes to a big giant church. I think it's Elevation Church. And they actually have a pastor that travels around and comes visits them.
Yeah.
And it's all online. It's really amazing, and it's new. He was a pastor at a vineyard church for many years, and this is, it's kind of like Amazon world.
Yeah.
So back to the legal.
Well, there is a radical idea that I want to give the parallel in the secular world. The world of nonprofit organizations is very heavily regulated. And that is true of churches in particular. There's a lot of things that churches can't do, and it's a complex area. Well, in the secular nonprofit world, Mark Zuckerberg several years ago indicated he was going to leave a sizable part of his fortune to charity.
Okay.
So everybody assumed that he was going to set up a private operating foundation exempt under 501c3. And he didn't. He just started a limited liability company, and he has complete control at the cost of paying income tax on it from his standpoint. Now, granted, he's got more money than the average church has, but for his thought is paying the tax is a worthwhile price to pay for the freedom of being able to put the money where it's going to be of some use. Now, the parallel from that to the church world is we have always assumed tax exemption is the most important thing when dealing with this issue. Ministries that are cutting edge ought to really seriously consider, is paying an income tax possibly a worthwhile price to carry out the ministry we want to carry out? Part of the reason why it makes sense is two of the big reasons why you generally want your organization to be tax exempt is, one, your donors get a tax deduction for their contribution.
Right.
But the way that the income tax system is set up now with recent changes, many church members don't itemize anyway, so it's not going to make a difference to them.
Correct.
And then on the church side, you pay taxes on your net revenue. And a typical church business, like if it is going to be a coffee shop where you also employ somebody to carry out a ministry function, the net income level is not going to be high. So if you've only got a margin of 2 or 3% anyway, the tax bill is not necessarily going to be that big a deal. It won't be your biggest expense. So there is that option of saying we're going to be effectively a for-profit ministry or a for-profit church. In some situations, that may make some sense. And while you do face a lot of regulation and concern in some areas because you're subject to discrimination law, you're also liberated from some of the other aspects of how you spend the money. And that is an option that is available that it seemed like a simple idea, but it just wasn't really on the radar until this increasingly has happened on the for-profit side.
Yeah, I mean, this is new territory.
Yeah, so that's this part that's interesting to me. It's like so you do an LLC. So like right now the nonprofit is like I have my statement of faith, and we are really good with our statement of faith to make sure it's pretty clear on some things that we're just going to actually take stands on. Nicene Creed is part of it, and then we've actually added a sexuality part.
Yeah.
But if you're an LLC, that is irrelevant. Am I right?
Well, you could still have the doctrinal statement.
Okay.
But the discrimination part, you're going to be unprotected. And the trend in law is that if you were doing something for profit, you've got to be generous to the public in not discriminating in any way. So this is an option that would definitely not work for some kinds of situations. For example, if you were to be a for-profit church that operated a coffee house, you may run into hiring discrimination
Oh,
issues that you
so
would
now you
have
have
to
that whole
address.
thing,
Yeah.
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 But for some that may not be an issue, that if some of the help is not what you would consider a part of the church family, that may work in some situations. Again, this goes to how cutting edge you're going to be.
Yeah.
Well, so that would be really coming down to is like how evangelistic do we? I mean, if we
Yeah.
really want to reach everybody, then that. If I have
Yeah.
a coffee shop, I really want to reach everybody. Then
Yeah.
it doesn't matter who comes in and we hire.
Now, there's another
Discrimination.
alternative. This is getting into some pretty narrow areas of law, but Section 501c3, well, Section 501c has a number of different kinds of nonprofit organizations.
Right.
One of them is a C4, which is a social welfare organization. And it's generally considered less worthwhile as an option to a charity because donors to a C4 social welfare organization don't get a tax deduction on their donation. But if that's not an issue, then you are tax exempt, meaning you don't pay taxes on your revenues, but you have a lot more freedom to do things that are not available to charities. So for a church that has a political agenda, the amount of political activity that a C4 can do is really expansive, where a C3, there's a lot of restrictions that make churches feel uncomfortable. So that would be an option, to actually have a church that is tax exempt under 501c4, and it can engage in that kind of activity with less regulation.
All right. So the welfare exemption part. So the C4 still owns the property.
Yeah.
The welfare exemption still. Does that still?
That's a property tax issue.
Yeah.
You would not, in many states, you would not be able to get a property tax exemption if you were a social welfare organization, C4 instead of a C3.
I see.
And that varies widely from state to state. And that can be a big issue. But for a kind of ministry that is a small coffee shop, where you're a commercial tenant, or a tenant in a commercial complex with multiple commercial tenants, any property tax exemption that you would get might not be worthwhile anyway. So depending upon the kind of work you do, these are options that definitely should be considered.
So we're talking about these church plant innovators that are doing house churches. Can you be in a house and be a church?
Yeah, you definitely can be.
Okay, so that's a physical location.
Because you'd ask about you're talking about an online church. So what prevents an online church from saying, my living room is the church, so now I have a physical location? Does that still? I know I'm asking you for a legal ruling. I got to be careful with this, but does that?
Yeah, because there's such a long history of churches meeting in unconventional spaces. Okay. That's an issue that the IRS has long since gotten past. So, like if you open up your business office to let a church meet in there, that's not going to endanger the tax exemption of the church because it's an unconventional space.
Okay.
I think
that's good.
If there is a concern that the IRS has generally that has fed into a lot of the definition of churches, is they don't want like a large family to declare themselves to be a church so that their meals are tax-free.
Right.
Okay.
So part of it is, do you show the indications of what churches typically have? And this is the part where it's really like American Protestantism, but the typical sign of a church is you meet weekly, you have some kind of transcendent experience of acknowledgement of a deity, and you have materials, you have a kind of licensing approach for the pastors, and you have a physical presence. That presence may move, but you have a physical presence.
Gotcha.
Okay.
So now, all of a sudden, when you've got a virtual church, the tax authority's first thought is, this sounds like a scam.
Yeah.
And we've got to look to see, is there really a church here? Well, a church has got to be physical. Well, no, it doesn't.
So it's really like,
interesting.
what's an employee? what's a freelancer or independent contractor? And we used to have this, I think, 14-point checklist if it looks like a duck. That our lawyers would tell us. But that's a huge issue today with living in this freelance or gig economy, where there's this whole freelance. So this is digital. It hits the church. Yeah. How about coffee shops and co-working? So these, coffee shops an older thing. I think, that started, about 10 years ago. And I think churches started doing coffee shops during the church hours, but then some thought, well, we have this thing here. Why don't we have it open and have our pastors out there kind of working and people come in, and it's a great way to get new people. Does that jeopardize?
It is a heavily regulated area.
Okay.
That could jeopardize a property tax.
Okay.
I'm actually only proficient in California's property tax law.
Is this a tough state?
It's a complicated state. So there are several different kinds of property tax exemptions. And if you operate a for-profit business on your property, then you don't qualify for the church exemption, which is the best in many ways. You can still qualify for the social welfare exemption, but you've got to parcel out the for-profit part. This is actually a problem with cell phone towers as well, that you got to change the property tax exemption if you lease out space on the church for a cell phone tower. So,
is that a thing that's happening at churches all over?
Oh yeah,
cell phone
churches
towers
are very popular. I think the advantage of having a symbol of our faith that involves a lot of verticality is actually made it kind of easy.
Easy targets, huh?
Yeah, but yeah, that's quite common. A number of churches have.
So if you have that, can you lose your welfare exemption?
Well, you can't have the church exemption because you're operating a for-profit activity on the property. So you parcel out the area that is for commercial space and pay property tax on that.
On that space.
Yeah, and then you just have the social welfare exemption for the rest.
That's interesting, because one of the things we'd heard about is that you have to. It's got to be based on usable space. It's like, well, if it's on my roof, how much usable space is that? It's because nobody's up there anyway.
In California, these decisions are made at the county level, so there's actually different treatment in different counties. And there are some that have actually taken the cubic footage and have taxed that, where others just look on the plane of the property of how much space is occupied, and you lose all of that even if there's multiple floors of non-commercial use.
Oh wow! So if you had a 14-story building,
so that's an issue that has not been resolved by custom yet. It's just too new an issue.
Yeah.
Okay.
And it does vary, and I know that they've had discussions about that within the Board of Equalization on what's the proper measure of something that is attached that's not a part of the actual structure itself. In the area of churches that may have what would be considered a for-profit business, every church should consider possibly incorporating that as a for-profit entity for which all the equity is owned by the church. That may not be necessary in every circumstance, but it should be considered for a variety of reasons. Insurance policies can get difficult to obtain if there's a combination of charitable and for-profit activity, and it can kind of mess up payroll for a variety of reasons. If you have a use that involves compensating people really high, so you end up having the non-traditional clergy are not the highest paid people in the entity, that can create difficulties all around. If you have one board, you've got your board that maybe the qualification is that you're considered the most spiritually mature, but in reality, you're actually setting the price for donuts for the coffee shop. It may not be a good fit. And the best solution in most circumstances, but it does involve some complexity, is to move all of that to a for-profit entity that can employ its own people, setting its own standards for employment. It obtains its own insurance, and it is controlled by the charity in the sense that the charity determines who goes on the board, but the members of the board of that entity are there because of their expertise in the field that is being undertaken.
So let's say there's a church that's been around for forever. It's one of the churches that are dying, and so the pastor wants to do some of these newer things. They've missed, because of the size of their building and some of these things, they're not going to be able to revive it in the normal way. So they're very open to, the coffee shops, cafe, co-working, vocational things, things that are pretty easy to do. Are you or attorneys like you, are you able to lay out a path? Because what they're not going to want to do is jeopardize their standing.
Right.
So the question is, they're going to start out with a motive. Okay, if we want to exist, if we want to reach people in our community, we're going to have to do some things differently.
Yeah.
Okay. So, one is they have to first get past, if I want to do that, are we going to, okay, let's just say they are. And now the question's going to come up, is there a way to do that without jeopardizing all these other things? Is there a path for them?
There is. And particularly, this problem is the most extreme in urban areas, where you've got property that may be sizable, that's in a commercially desirable area, and the congregations become very small. And there is no prohibition on renting out some of that space for commercial purposes. Outside the church area, if you want to know my favorite extreme example of how a charity can maximize value is one of the oldest colleges in New York, Cooper Union, which is old enough that Abraham Lincoln gave a speech there, one of his well-known speeches. They allowed part of their property to be developed commercially, and that's where the Chrysler building is situated. So the Chrysler building is a for-profit structure that pays a very handsome rent to Cooper Union, who is their landlord. And that's entirely doable. The revenues from the Chrysler building far exceed that of Cooper Union, which is a pretty small school. And the tax area gets very complex. Charities do not have to pay taxes on their passive investments, income tax, but they do have to pay on businesses they operate. So were Cooper Union to be the landlord, where they're actually collecting rents and setting rent and that kind of thing, they would be actively involved in the business of renting offices in New York, and they would pay an income tax on that. But they've hired a broker, so all they do is collect the payments of the broker.
There's a way to do it.
Yeah, there's a way to do it. And it's the same thing with churches that are near parade routes or near farmers market, where you can rent out, like if you've got a parking lot that is very useful commercially, if the church was to operate a commercial parking lot, they have to pay taxes on that. That's unrelated business income. But if they merely rent out the parking lot to a parking lot company, it is very likely that that would be set up as a passive investment, and they're just collecting rents and royalties.
That makes sense.
So they don't have to pay an income tax on it.
So if a church said, okay, to really change our community, we want to do this, 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 and this. I'm just, from a coffee shop to cafe to co-working to vocational types of boot camps, things that have really been in the for-profit world, but they're not really doing it for profit anymore. They're just ways to reach people.
Yeah.
But this is, so they have the whole theological side that they have to work through.
Yeah.
But let's assume they get through that. Now, is what you're saying, there's a way to do it, but you have to come see a lawyer like yourself that would say, these are the things that you're going to have to do, but you don't have to lose your church. There's ways where you don't have to.
There are ways that it can be done.
Yeah.
But it's very fact specific. I'm sure we could come up with ways where it could not be done.
Yeah.
But for the most part, charities have been engaged in for-profit business for a very long time, and they may have tax liability, or there are ways to set it up that might reduce or eliminate income tax liability. But it's definitely worth seeking assistance on that. It is not a good risk to say, oh, I saw the church in another city was doing things this way. We're going to do it.
It's not a do-it-yourself.
It's not a do-it-yourself thing.
We're going to do it. We can't just go watch a YouTube video and then
Right, yeah. But chances are, if it's like the urban setting we're talking about, it's going to generate income. So paying for the kind of services you need for legal and accounting work is not going to detract from funds available to ministry if you never took the idea up in the first place.
Okay.
So it's worth exploring.
Yeah, I think the large churches with the money and the resources, they're used to dealing with the lawyers and all the, they have the money to do whatever they want to do. But the small guys don't know what to do.
Yeah.
And this, my heart, we both have a passion for, because, if you weren't an innovator, you would have ended up that way. But you've been an innovator from, and so Scott gets us to speak to this innovation. Well, the question comes up. He's talked about, man, we've had to go through 7 law firms to get an answer on a simple thing, and where if it was a for-profit thing, you could call one and get your answer. So, if there's a pastor out there that would watch this today, this interview that we're doing with you today, whether it's at a conference or just out there, don't do it yourself.
Yeah.
Go see an attorney, and are we even allowed to say that Church Law Center is? Can you say those things with the lawyer anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, we'd be happy to talk to anybody. I think the important thing in looking for a lawyer is to get one that works with nonprofit organizations.
Yeah, true.
Because most that work in the area of nonprofit law are familiar with church law generally, because they have a lot of clients, even if they're not necessarily religious lawyers themselves. They've got the knowledge of how to work in that area.
Any final questions, sir?
No, I think it's been very helpful, and I appreciate that. And I know that I don't want anybody watching the YouTube and saying, "Okay, I know what to do now." But
Yeah.
I wish I knew about you in 2016, and
Right.
because so when we knew we had to go speak at the first conference and we're going to do a second, we were in searching, and I was like, okay, here's this guy local, Newport Beach, and dean of a law school.
Yeah.
It doesn't get more qualified. And then when we found out you're a missionary, it's like, oh, this has been amazing. So I want to thank you so much for inviting us in. We've kind of occupied your office for probably way longer than you thought. But I think you're the kind of guy that if we all had the time, we could really hear some stories.
It's a very interesting area of practice, and it's always something new every day.
Myron, thank you so much,
Thank you so much.
for being with us today.
Appreciate it.
Well, it's great to be with you.
All right.